This is the story of when one of the worst nuclear disasters in the history of mankind threatened to render the European continent uninhabitable for thousands of years. Episode 1. Exactly 2 years after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, Soviet chemist Valery Legasov secretly records a series of memoirs discussing how the Soviet state has covered the Chernobyl incident in an illusion of lies. He mentions how, in order to cover the tragedy of the incident, the state sought someone to blame, and the prime candidate for it was Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, who was already an arrogant and unpleasant man, and the only man who was responsible for the control room that unfortunate night. Furthermore, Dyatlov doesn't have any important friends in the state to defend his honor. Though he was sentenced to 10 years in a prison labor camp, Legasov believes that despite Dyatlov's crime, there were far more criminal people responsible. Dyatlov's own crime was deserving of death, and not 10 years for mismanagement. He wishes the best of luck to the person who will release these memoirs, packs them in a newspaper, and leaves his house on the pretense of throwing rubbish in order to hide it in a window in a dark alley while a KGB officer watches from a distance. Afterward, he returns to his apartment, leaves ample food for his cat, smokes a cigarette to calm his nerves, and ends himself. The scene then shifts to exactly 2 years and 1 minute earlier, to Pripyat, Ukrainian SSR. Lyudmila Ignatenko, the heavily pregnant wife of Vasily Ignatenko, a member of the emergency services, has difficulty sleeping due to her condition. She goes into the kitchen to prepare something, and at exactly 1 hour, 23 minutes and 45 seconds a.m., on April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 explodes at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. As the ground shakes, Vasily and the other residents of Pripyat wake up. Inside the control room, Anatoly Dyatlov tries to maintain discipline and orders the employees to start the backup pumps in order to pump water through the core and cool it down. However, he's informed by a man named Valery Perevoshenko, the foreman in the reactor section, that there is no core as it exploded. Dyatlov refuses to believe this, saying that Valery is in shock because RBMK reactors don't explode. Dyatlov orders Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptanov to control the core by manually adding water and calling emergency services to extinguish the fire. When he leaves the control room, Dyatlov sees graphite on the ground. Vasily Ignatenko is also called as part of the fire extinguishing team. Lyudmila has a bad feeling about the ordeal and tries to stop him, but Vasily assures her that it's just a fire. At 1:26 a.m., Valery is shocked when the dosimeter gives a reading of 3.6 Roentgen of radiation, which is the highest number the meter can go. Suddenly, his face starts showing the effects of radiation poisoning. Other employees of the power plant are vomiting blood and running everywhere, and even Valery starts vomiting blood, unable to move any further. Viktor Proskuryakov, a senior reactor control engineer trainee at Chernobyl, is still in the pump room, heavily bleeding and on death's door, and he tells one of the employees to look for Valery Kodymchuk, the night shift main circulating pump operator at Chernobyl. However, there is a massive crater where Kodymchuk was supposed to be, with the core entirely exposed. Dyatlov returns to the control room to inform them that he dropped the control rods from another panel, but Akimov informs him that they're still only a third of a way in for unknown reasons, and he sent the trainees to the reactor hall to lower them by hand. He asks about the pumps, but Toptanov informs him that Kodymchuk is not responding, but Dyatlov tells them to go down there and manually function the pump. When he asks about the dosimeter reading, he comments that it's not great, but not terrible upon learning of the 3.6 Roentgen reading. At 1:30, the emergency services arrive at the scene, along with Vasily, and as they prepare to take out the fire, they taste metal in the air. As more trainees try to reach the reactor hall to lower the control rods, they're informed that there are neither the control rods nor the core. Suddenly, Vasily's friend Misha starts screaming in pain, but he cannot leave the hose. He notices that the skin on Misha's hand is falling. The trainees open the reactor hall door only to see the exposed core and immediately run away. Lyudmila is standing outside in anticipation when she notices that her neighbors are going to the railroad bridge to get a closer look. Her friend Oskana invites her, but Lyudmila thinks that it could be dangerous. Oskana reassures her that Vasily will be fine and tells her to get some rest. The trainee returns to the control room to inform Dyatlov that the core is exposed, and he saw it with his own eyes. But Dyatlov insists that he is delusional. Suddenly, he starts bleeding, and Dyatlov orders Toptanov to take him to the infirmary and tells Akimov that the skin of the trainee's face was damaged due to being exposed to mildly contaminated feed water. He then orders Akimov to call in the day shift, but Akimov is too shocked to function. Infuriated, Dyatlov informs him that he's going to the administration building to call plant manager Viktor Bryukhanov and chief engineer Nikolai Fomin, and should Akimov refuse to follow his orders, Dyatlov can make him out to be the one responsible for the situation. Fomin and Bryukhanov appear at the power plant at 2:30 a.m. Fomin tries to do damage control, but Bryukhanov walks straight into the meeting, where only Dyatlov is waiting for him, and jokingly says that his safety test was a failure. But Dyatlov responds, even to the surprise of Fomin, that he has the situation under control. Bryukhanov is worried that he has to inform the Central Committee about this mishap, but Dyatlov tells him that he cannot be blamed for it. To selectively inform the committee about the facts, Bryukhanov tells Dyatlov to tell him how the situation began. Dyatlov begins by informing him that he started a safety test which was approved by Fomin, and it was engineer Toptonov who encountered technical difficulties, which led to the accumulation of hydrogen in the control system tank, which ignited and set the roof on fire. Fomin notices how Dyatlov entirely removed the blame from him and informs Bryukhanov that Dyatlov, as the deputy chief engineer, was supervising the test. When Bryukhanov asks about the core, Dyatlov mentions that he has men trying to ensure a steady flow of water to it, and though the radiation is 3.6 Rontgen in the reactor building, it's largely due to the feed water. Bryukhanov assumes that these facts are enough to communicate to the Central Committee. Meanwhile, Oskana and the rest of the citizens of Pripyat are mesmerized by the colorful lights of the fire and are unknowingly exposed to lethal radiation doses as nuclear ash rains down on them. Boris Stolyarchuk, a control engineer, goes downstairs to investigate, only to find a wounded trainee who comments that it's over for them. Suddenly, feed water starts raining down. Vasily and the rest of the firemen move deeper into the reactor to put out the fires. Boris tells Akimov and Toptonov about the situation, saying there's only a ditch where the core is supposed to be, but Akimov insists that they have to manually turn the valves to pump water into the core, because believing otherwise would mean that they've exposed millions of people to radiation poisoning, and the blame will fall on them. He decides to take Toptonov with him to try. Boris pleads to Toptonov, but he doesn't listen either. Akimov tells Boris to watch over the control panels, which aren't even functioning. Anatoly Sitnikov, Chernobyl's deputy chief operational engineer, goes to Building 2 to retrieve a good dosimeter from its safe. At 5:20 a.m., the Pripyat Executive Committee appears at the Chernobyl power plant to hold a meeting with Bryukhanov, who understates the severity of the situation and assures them that the USSR President, Mikhail Gorbachev, is being informed of the situation, and orders will soon come down. He insists that the accident is under control, and because Soviet Industries' nuclear plans are a state secret, Bryukhanov decides to lock down the city and cut phone lines to prevent panic and misinformation. Furthermore, the Central Committee is sending a detachment of military police to Pripyat. But when Bryukhanov mentions that between 2,000 and 4,000 men are coming, the committee becomes suspicious of the severity of the matter. When Fomin insists that the radiation is only limited to the plant, Petrov, a member of the committee, denies it, saying they saw men vomiting with burns on their skins outside the plant. He suggests evacuating their families, but Bryukhanov insists that his wife is in Pripyat too and wouldn't keep her here if it weren't safe. However, the head of the committee agrees with the suggestion, saying that since the state has advised them to do such, they should listen to the state. As he's met with applause, Anatoly Sitnikov is waiting outside to meet them. Once the room empties, Bryukhanov invites him inside, and Sitnikov informs the group that he used dosimeters with 1,000 Rontgen capacity to measure the radiation. Still, the meter burned out the second it was turned on, indicating that the radiation might just be above 1,000 Rontgen. Bryukhanov, however, thinks that the dosimeter was faulty, but Sitnikov says he used another dosimeter from the military fire department with a limit of 200 Rontgen, which also maxed out. However, Bryukhanov and the others insist that the second meter was also faulty, and Dyatlov wonders how Sitnikov can get such an absurd number from the radiation of the feed water. Sitnikov then tells them that he discovered graphite among the rubble around Building 4, which usually surrounds the core to keep it cool. Dyatlov loses his composure, but Fomin calms him down and asks Sitnikov if the core exploded. When he says yes, Fomin asks for an explanation of how an RBMK reactor can explode since both of them are engineers, but neither of them has an answer. Dyatlov decides to go himself to confirm whether the core exploded, but suddenly starts vomiting and falls down. The guards take him to the infirmary, but Fomin assures Bryukhanov that Dyatlov also got sick due to the feed water. He then orders Sitnikov to go to the roof and see into the core, and though Sitnikov is terrified, they order him to do it. Despite everything, Akimov takes Toptanov with him to turn the valves, and though Akimov says they did nothing wrong, Toptanov starts sobbing, admitting that they were wrong. When Sitnikov looks down from the rooftop, all he sees is the exposed core, and his face becomes red. As Dyatlov is being escorted to the infirmary, he watches as emergency workers fall sick, Vasily among them, and he's exposed to the reality of the situation for once. When Sitnikov tells Bryukhanov and Fomin about the situation, they are horrified. Suddenly, hospitals are full of people from Chernobyl. Soviet chemist Valery Legasov is called by Deputy Chairman of the Council of Ministers, Boris Sherbina, to inform him about the Chernobyl incident. Though Boris's report suggests that there was a mild fire and the core is being pumped with water. Before Legasov can ask any questions, however, Boris rushes to inform him that USSR President Mikhail Gorbachev has appointed him to a committee to manage the accident due to his expertise on RBMK reactors. Meanwhile, Akimov and Toptanov continue to grow sick due to the contaminated feed water. In the morning, as normalcy returns to Pripyat, birds begin to fall due to the radiated atmosphere, and the first episode ends. Episode 2. 7 hours after the explosion, at the Institute for Nuclear Energy in Minsk, Byelorussian SSR, nuclear physicist Ulana Komyuk is sleeping in her office when she's woken up by a student, Dmitry, who informs her that the institute is empty except for them both because it's Saturday. However, the dosimeter detects a radiation spike when he opens the window to allow air. She takes a sample from the air, only to discover iodine 131 in it, which is the consequence of uranium decay. They think it's from Ignalina, a reactor 240 kilometers away, but upon calling them, Ulana learns that it's not them. The next closest reactor is Chernobyl, but it's 400 kilometers away. While Dmitry discusses what could be the cause of this, Ulana calls Chernobyl, but no one answers the phone. Back at Pripyat Hospital 6, the scene is one of utter chaos, as more and more people are brought in due to radiation burns. Nurse Zachenko takes command and orders to prioritize women and children, but they do not have enough IVs to treat all the patients. She goes inside and is shocked to see when one of the nurses is treating Vasily's burns with milk and tells the staff to remove the contaminated clothes of the patients first and move them to the basement. Lyudmila arrives at the hospital after learning that her husband, Vasily, is inside, but military police officers refuse anyone entry. Suddenly, a man breaks through the crowd and tries to enter the hospital. As the officers are distracted, Lyudmila makes her run and manages to enter the hospital. Nurses start dumping the contaminated clothes in the basement, and Zachenko sees the effects of radiation poisoning on her own hand. At the Kremlin, Legasov is anxiously waiting to enter the meeting and is given a report of the situation written by Boris. He's horrified by what he reads, and when he's called inside, Legasov walks in a state of shock. In the meeting hall, Legasov sees Boris, Gorbachev, and the Soviet Central Committee. During the briefing, Boris echoes Dyatlov's false report and ensures Gorbachev that the foreign press is totally unaware of the situation and that General Vladimir Pikhalov, the commander of the Soviet chemical forces, has been dispatched. Furthermore, he told the meeting that the radiation was only 3.6 Roentgen, which is equivalent to an X-ray. Legasov is obviously shocked by all this. Satisfied, Gorbachev adjourns the meeting, but Legasov finds the courage to halt them. Though Boris tells him to address any concerns privately to him later, Legasov proceeds to read through Boris's own report to inform them that there's graphite on the ground of Chernobyl. Since graphite can only be found inside the core, this means that the reactor core exploded and the core is exposed. Furthermore, 3.6 Roentgen radiation is the equivalent of 400 X-rays and is the maximum reading of smaller dosimeters, meaning that the actual number could be quite high. Based on graphite on the ground, whoever picked it up was exposed to the equivalent of 4 million X-rays. When Boris accuses Legasov of spreading alarmist conspiracies, Legasov pleads to Gorbachev to allow him to calmly explain the facts, and Gorbachev agrees. Legasov tells the meeting that RBMK reactors use uranium-235. Every gram of U-235 holds billions to trillions of radiation particles, and Chernobyl holds over 3 million grams of U-235. Exposing such a dangerous quantity of U-235 to the air means that these radiation particles will be carried to the entire European continent, effectively contaminating the air, water, and food for the whole continent. And this will not stop for over 50,000 years. Gorbachev is shocked that Legasov would deduce such a thing merely from the description of a rock and decides to send Boris and Legasov to Chernobyl to investigate and report personally to him. On the way, Boris asks Legasov to educate him on how a nuclear reactor works. Legasov explains that a nuclear reactor makes electricity with steam. Steam turns a turbine, which generates electricity. While a normal power plant burns coal to generate steam, a nuclear power plant uses a fission reaction to generate steam, which functions by causing the atoms of uranium to bounce into each other. The force of this impact splits the atom apart, releasing a tremendous amount of energy. The graphite is used to surround the fuel rods in order to moderate the flux of the neutrons. Back at the hospital, Lyudmila is still searching for Vasily, but the staff is too busy to help her. She finds her neighbor Mikhail, who tells her to take her infant daughter away from him, as he's contaminated with radiation and is a danger to the infant, but the nurse tells her to go away. At the reception, she learns that Vasily is being transported to Moscow with other patients. Major Burov tells her to go to Moscow to see him. When Lyudmila tells him that the city is under lockdown, Major Burov tells her to mention his name. As they reach Chernobyl, Legasov can tell from a glance that graphite is everywhere due to the explosion, and the core is exposed. When Boris doubts it, Legasov tells him to look at the glow, which is an indication of radiation ionizing the air. But Boris is still doubtful and orders the pilot to fly directly over the building. Desperate, Legasov tells him that should they fly directly over the exposed core, all of them will be dead within a week. However, Boris threatens to shoot the pilot should he not comply. Legasov tells the pilot that should he accept that order, he'd be begging for this bullet soon due to the pain. The pilot swerves the helicopter. Meanwhile, at the Belarusian Communist Party headquarters, Ulana rushes to talk to Deputy Secretary Garanin to inform him of the situation, but he tells his assistant to send her away. Ulana walks into the office uninvited and tells him that she knows that the core of Chernobyl is either partially or completely exposed, though Garanin denies it. She further tells him to issue iodine tablets to the residents of the city and evacuate Minsk, or thousands of people will get cancer and many more will die. Though Garanin repeats the state's missive that Chernobyl is under control, Ulana tells him that it's not and reminds him that she's speaking as a nuclear physicist, whereas Garanin worked in a shoe factory before becoming the deputy secretary. Infuriated, he sends her away. Before leaving, she leaves iodine tablets for Garanin's assistant and tells her to leave Minsk and go as far east as possible. Meanwhile, Pikolov's soldiers arrive at Chernobyl, much to the concern of Brukhanov and Fomin, who believe that this show is to make them look bad. However, Brukhanov tells him that Boris is a pure bureaucrat and thus stupid and can be convinced by their simpler version of the events. They go to meet Boris, Legasov, and Pikolov, and Brukhanov tells Boris that they've been very successful in containing the damage. Furthermore, he prepares a list of individuals whom he believes should be held accountable for the incident. Brukhanov and Fomin blame Legasov for spreading dangerous misinformation and ask him to explain how the RBMK reactor can explode. But much like everyone else, Legasov cannot explain it. They consider his act disgraceful, but Boris asks them why there was graphite on the roof, since it's only meant to be present inside the core. Brukhanov clearly did not expect Boris to be educated about this matter and asked Fomin to explain, but Fomin is taken aback by this and tells Boris that he must have seen burnt concrete, but Boris knows how concrete works and tells him that it is not concrete. To prove that Legasov is right, Pikolov offers to use a military-grade high-range dosimeter to get a reading from the reactor by transporting it in a truck with lead shielding. Legasov tells Pikolov to get as close to the fire and cover the driver with as much protection as possible. To avoid putting his men in danger, Pikolov offers to be the driver himself. Pikolov enters a truck and breaks open the lock by driving into it while Legasov sits in anticipation. After some time, Pikolov returns, and he and the truck are immediately disinfected. He reveals that the actual number is 15,000 Roentgens. Legasov reveals that the fire is releasing twice the radiation of the Hiroshima bombs every single hour. Since it has been 20 hours since the explosion, it means the radiation is 40 bombs worth now. Boris terminates Brukhanov and Fomin. As they're being taken away by soldiers, Fomin insists that Dyatlov is responsible. Pikolov suggests dropping water through helicopters to put out the fire, but Legasov tells him that radiation fire cannot be put out with water, as the extreme temperature of 2,000 degrees will instantly vaporize the water. He says they need to smother the core fire with an estimated 5,000 tons of sand and boron, which will create problems later. Furthermore, they have to evacuate Pripyat. Boris refuses to accept this since it will cause chaos. Disappointed, Legasov goes to the nearest hotel, which is still functioning normally, to rest for the night. One of the residents of Pripyat, recognizing him as coming from Moscow, asks him if they should be worried about the fire, and Legasov is forced to lie that everything is under control. Meanwhile, plant and animal life in Pripyat begins to die out. On April 27, 30 hours after the explosion, helicopters appear carrying boron and sand, and Legasov tells Boris to warn them not to fly directly over the core while making their drop, but to maintain a minimum of the 10-meter perimeter. As one helicopter gets too close, Legasov tells Boris to warn the helicopter to get behind and allow the wind to carry the sand. But communication starts breaking due to the radiation, and once the helicopter emerges from the smoke, it melts and crashes. Legasov tells Boris that there's no other way to do this, and Boris sends another helicopter from the west. Meanwhile, at the Kurchatov Institute in Moscow, Marina Gruzinskaya receives a call from Ulana from Minsk. The two speak in code, and Ulana learns that they're dropping sand and boron over Chernobyl. Though Dmitry finds it reasonable, Ulana notices something in the ground plans of Chernobyl and decides to pay it a visit. Boris visits Legasov in his hotel room to inform him that the operation is going smoothly and that they've made 20 drops so far, but Legasov is concerned about the residents. Boris tells him that he talked to Professor Ilyin, who says that the radiation isn't high enough to merit an evacuation. But Legasov tells him that Ilyin isn't a physicist, but a medical doctor. When Boris mentions that they're here too, Legasov tells him that they have already been exposed to a fatal radiation dose and could be dead in about 5 years. Suddenly, the phone rings and Boris is informed that a nuclear plant all the way in Sweden has detected radiation, and it has been identified as a leak from Chernobyl. Furthermore, the Americans have taken satellite images of Chernobyl, and now the whole world knows, despite all their attempts at secrecy. The wind is carrying the smoke to Germany, and people have been quarantined in Frankfurt, while Boris finds their children playing outside the windows. 36 hours after the explosion, buses leave en masse from Pripyat as Boris finally agrees to evacuate the city. Soldiers enter all the individual apartment blocks to escort all residents to the buses. As buses leave Pripyat, Ulana arrives but is denied entrance, as Pripyat is now a restricted area. Ulana refuses to leave, even accepting arrest should it allow her inside the city. The soldier realizes that Ulana is an expert, who is already aware that the core is exposed and they are smothering the fire with sand and boron, and takes her to Legasov, to whom she outright says that smothering the fire is a mistake, as the sand will eventually heat. Legasov explains that he's aware of that and that it might be a month until that happens, but Ulana says he has approximately 2 days. She informs them that because the fire extinguishers have been gushing water into the structure this whole time, the superheated sand will volatilize the water tanks, which are now full, triggering a catastrophic steam explosion. Boris's time to report to the Kremlin has arrived. Gorbachev is angry at the damage to USSR's global perception this incident has caused and asks Boris to make his report, but Boris tells Legasov to deliver the briefing. Legasov begins by delivering the good news that they've managed to somewhat douse the fire, and there's been a reduction in the radiation emissions, but the fire will take another 2 weeks to extinguish. However, this causes another problem. The nuclear fuel will not turn cold once the fire is extinguished, but the blanket of sand will actually cause its temperature to rise. The uranium will melt the sand, which will create lava, which will, in turn, melt through the shield below before the lava reaches the earth and contaminates the water. But the large water tanks under the reactor are now full of approximately 7,000 cubic meters of water, which will cause a thermal explosion between 2 and 4 megatons, which will also destroy the 3 remaining nuclear reactors at Chernobyl. The explosion will carry the entire radioactive material, making it fatal to the entire population of Kyiv and Minsk. The radiation itself will impact all of Ukraine, Latvia, Lithuania, and Belarus, as well as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and most of East Germany. And this can happen between 2 and 4 days. The solution to this problem is to send 3 plant workers to drain the reservoirs by entering the basement and manually opening its sluice gates. However, the level of radioactive contamination in these waters is fatal enough to kill these workers within a week, and for that, they need Gorbachev's permission. Gorbachev gives his permission. 56 hours after the explosion, Pripyat is a ghost town. Boris and Legasov gathered the plant workers to give them an overview of their plan and told them that the volunteers would be rewarded with a yearly stipend of 400 rubles in promotions. However, the workers are hesitant about volunteering, already aware that the radiation level is fatal. Boris says that it must be done, as millions of people will die if it's not, and the people of the Soviet Union are known for their ability to sacrifice their lives for others. Alexei Yanonenko volunteers first, and his bravery inspires two others, Valery Bezpalov and Boris Baranov. The men are strapped in hazmat suits and armed with flashlights. They enter the reactor and brave its darkness, their dosimeters clicking rapidly. They enter the tunnels and try to navigate their way, but their dosimeters start clicking wildly, and the radiation disrupts their flashlights, leaving them in darkness, and the second episode ends. Episode 3. They use hand-pumped flashlights to guide their way. Meanwhile, outside, Boris wonders if it's possible that the water has already killed them, and Legasov does not deny the possibility. But the men are alive and progressing and are able to drain the basement reservoirs. They walk out of the building and are met with cheers. Meanwhile, at Hospital Number 6 in Moscow, 4 days after the explosion, Lyudmila asks to see Vasily, but the receptionist informs her that Chernobyl victims are not allowed any visitors. She mentions Major Burov to no avail and eventually decides to bribe the receptionist, which works. She shows the pass to a nurse but says there are no exceptions to the rule. Lyudmila tries to bribe her too, but the nurse stops her and allows her to see Vasily for only 30 minutes without touching him at all. Before leaving, the nurse asks if Lyudmila is pregnant, but she says no. She finds Vasily healthy and playing cards and, despite the nurse's warning, goes in and hugs him. As the soldiers perform radiation checks with dosimeters to confirm if their plan is working, Legasov is having an argument with Boris because the evacuation zone was decided to be 30 kilometers, whereas the effects of radioactive materials can be seen up to 200 kilometers. Legasov expresses his frustration with ignorant party members making ignorant decisions. Pikolov informs them that they have visual confirmation that the fire is nearly extinguished, and iodine 131 is reducing in the atmosphere. But the meltdown has begun. At night, Lyudmila is sleeping in the corridor of the hospital when she's woken up by Vasily's screams of pain. She rushes into the room, only to find him surrounded by nurses who escort her out. Boris calls Gorbachev to inform him that the situation inside the core is deteriorating faster than expected, and the concrete pad will only last for 6 to 8 weeks, after which there is a 50% chance that the fuel will melt down into the groundwater. This groundwater goes into the Pripyat River, which feeds into the Dnieper River, the primary water supply for approximately 50 million people. Legasov recommends installing a heat exchanger under the pad to lower the core temperature and halt the meltdown. To achieve that, they will need all the liquid nitrogen in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev approves it, but Legasov immediately brings up the issue of the exclusion zone, revealing that the half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,000 years, which means that Chernobyl will not be safe for living for the foreseeable future. Gorbachev ends the call. Boris takes Legasov out for a walk and asks him to reveal precisely what the radiation will do. Legasov reveals that the radiation is enough to cause radiation poisoning, which will result in skin blisters, death of bone marrow, failure of the immune system, decomposition of the organs and soft tissue, and leakage of arteries and veins, which will cause pain so immense that even morphine won't be enough, and finally death in either 3 days or 3 weeks. For Legasov and Boris, there is the possibility of fatal cancer or aplastic anemia. Boris points out 2 people spying on them around the corner. He tells Legasov that the KGB is spying on them. The reason he walked outside is that everything around them is bugged. Because they can see the KGB agents, it means that they want them to know about the surveillance. Legasov goes on to discuss with Ulana how the RBMK reactor could explode, but despite all of their calculations, it's not possible. But it did explode. Legasov instructs Ulana to interview Dyatlov, Akimov, and Toptanov and investigate the cause of the explosion, who are all in Moscow's Hospital Number 6. He prompts her to hurry while they're still alive, because if they don't discover the cause of it, it might happen again. Meanwhile, Gorbachev authorizes a large team of miners from Tula, Russian SFSR, to excavate an area beneath the core and install the heat exchanger. Shadov, the Minister of Coal Industries, goes to meet the crew in Tula, their chief, Glukov, and orders him to get his crew and enter the truck. But when Glukov asks where they're going, Shadov says it's classified. Glukov refuses to leave and threatens to kill Shadov should his soldiers start shooting. Shadov is forced to reveal that they are needed to prevent the nuclear meltdown and contamination of the surrounding watershed at Chernobyl. This convinces Glukov, who starts to walk towards the trucks, but not before tapping Shadov with his dirty hands. The rest of the crew members follow, dirtying Shadov's clean clothes to make him look more like a minister of coal. Vasily's skin is blistering, and when he wakes up, Lyudmila is beside him, kissing his arm. He warns her against touching since the nurses warned her, but Lyudmila says since they can touch him, so can she. All of Vasily's crew members have been taken away. He tells Lyudmila to look outside the window and tell him what she sees. He jokes that he made true of his promise of taking her to see Moscow. Ulana, dressed as a nurse, enters Dyatlov's room, and he tells her to either offer him a decent meal or leave the room. As Glukov and his men arrive at Chernobyl, Legasov is nervous and tells Boris that he cannot lie to them about the threat to their lives that awaits them. Boris suggests he should tell them the truth, as miners are always surrounded by danger. Glukov arrives and Legasov tells him that they have to work under a concrete pad, above which is the core of the nuclear reactor, which is melting down. If they finish their work in 6 weeks, however, Glukov's crew can survive. Because they cannot disrupt anything on the surface, they cannot use any machinery for the digging and have to dig manually. Glukov asks for at least 400 men for the job. Glukov thinks the tunnel they have to dig in order to reach the bottom of the concrete pad should be 6 meters. But Legasov recommends 12 meters for his protection against radiation. Glukov says it's futile since they are already being exposed to the radiation. Boris suggests starting tomorrow morning, but Glukov wants to work immediately since he doesn't want his men in Chernobyl any second more than necessary. 9 days after the explosion, the tunnel continues to progress. Glukov asks for fans, but Pikalov says that fans will raise dust in the air, which will enter the lungs of the workers. Glukov says that they've been breathing dust for 20 years, but Pikalov says that this is irradiated dust. Ulana goes to meet Toptanov, who appears to be in the worst condition and is willing to talk. Through pain, Toptanov reveals that, at the young age of 25, he was promoted to the rank of senior engineer at Chernobyl. As Vasily's condition worsens, he's escorted to a special room, and the nurse is shocked to learn that, despite her warnings, Lyudmila has been with Vasily for days. Lyudmila argues that she's been taking care of Vasily while she was busy with other patients. The nurse tells her that the situation has worsened for Vasily now, but Lyudmila pleads she doesn't want him to die alone. The nurse eventually allows her to stay on the other side of the plastic. However, once inside the room, Lyudmila passes the plastic to comfort Vasily and sees that most of his skin has fallen off. To comfort him, she reveals to Vasily that she's pregnant. Back at Chernobyl, Boris informs Legasov that the fire is extinguished, and the miners believe that their work will be finished in 4 weeks. He tells Legasov to celebrate. Suddenly, he and Boris are informed that the miners are working completely naked due to the extreme heat of the tunnel. Legasov tells Glukov that they are less protected now, but he doesn't care. He asks Boris if the state will take care of his men after the job, but Boris refuses to make any promises. Glukov has no choice but to continue the work. Meanwhile, Toptanov tells Ulana that during their safety test, the power level jumped from 200 to 400 megawatts, and Akimov initiated the emergency shutdown procedure by pressing the button AZ5. It was this moment that triggered the explosion. Ulana considers it impossible, but Toptanov insists that it happened. She then goes to confirm this with Akimov, who insists he pressed the button and did everything right. Ulana witnesses Lyudmila with her husband on her way out and drags her out. She tells the nurse that Lyudmila is pregnant. She threatens to reveal this oversight to everyone but is arrested by the KGB. Boris and Legasov arrive at the Kremlin for a meeting, where Boris informs him that the KGB arrested Ulana last night. Boris says he's working to have her released. They enter the meeting room to share the progress they've made so far with Gorbachev, and the entire room breaks into applause. During the meeting, Boris directly addresses Charkov, the KGB's first deputy chairman, saying that he can confirm he and Legasov have made the utmost effort to protect the secrets of the state. He then allows Legasov to speak, who says that radioactive debris and contamination have spread to approximately 26,000 square kilometer radius around Chernobyl, and he believes this entire area must be evacuated. Furthermore, all animals inside this zone, whether domesticated or wild, must be put down to prevent the spread of contamination. Around Chernobyl itself, they must raise entire forests, rip up the top layer of the Earth, and bury it under itself because the geology surrounding Chernobyl has absorbed dangerous amounts of radiation, which can be carried by wind and elements later. And finally, they must seal the Chernobyl plant permanently. This entire procedure will require even more deaths and sacrifices. The effort will take up to 3 years and require up to 750,000 men, with deaths expected in thousands to tens of thousands. Gorbachev tells them to begin at once. Once the meeting is over, Legasov rushes towards Charkov to the shock of Boris. Charkov denies knowing about the arrest of Ulana and admits that he has people following Legasov. But he shows him that there are people following him too, as the KGB is a circle of accountability. Boris promises to be accountable for Ulana, which convinces Charkov, who then agrees to release her. Legasov goes to meet Ulana, who tells him that she was arrested because of her outburst regarding Lyudmila, and that Dyatlov wouldn't talk to her. They discuss how haphazard their planning has been regarding controlling the Chernobyl plant, and how it is quite possible that they're causing deaths for nothing. Legasov wants to stop, but he cannot. Neither of them has any choice in this matter because, as scientists, they have to find the cause of the explosion. Once Ulana is released, she tells Legasov that she confirmed with Toptanov and Akimov that the reactor exploded after they pressed the AZ-5 button and not before it. She decides to return to the hospital in order to discover what really happened. At Legasov's demand, the Chernobyl exclusion zone is expanded, and hundreds of liquidators are conscripted to decontaminate the forests, topsoil, and wildlife. Lyudmila watches as the bodies of Vasily and several others are entombed within zinc caskets, lowered into a mass grave and buried in concrete. This is where the third episode ends. Episode 4. An elderly woman milks her cow as if ritually. A Soviet soldier tells her to evacuate, but she refuses to move, saying she's lived in this house for 82 years of her life. When the soldier warns her not to cause trouble for him, the woman explains that he's not the first soldier to threaten her village with a gun, as when she was 12 years old, the revolution happened, and the Tsar's men marched through the village. After that, it was the Bolsheviks. After them came Stalin's men, then the Holodomor, which claimed the lives of her parents and sisters, but she didn't leave. After them came the Second World War, in which the Nazis came, then the Russians. Her own brothers went to fight and never returned, but she remained in the village through all of this. She refuses to leave now. Furious, the soldier picks up her bucket of milk and drops it outside, but the woman resumes her work. The soldier shoots the cow dead, but she remains seated. 4 months after the explosion, Lyudmila moves into an apartment in Kyiv, pregnant and alone. The liquidators begin their work in the Chernobyl exclusion zone of Pripyat. Legasov and Boris meet General Nikolai Tarakhanov, the chief supervisor of the cleanup operation, who asks why the core is still exposed. Legasov explains that they cannot proceed with it until the nuclear graphite and other debris from the Chernobyl rooftop is cleared from the rooftop and pushed into the core. However, the level of radiation on the rooftop would kill anyone within hours. He suggests using remote-controlled bulldozers from Afghanistan, but they're too heavy and would fall right through. Legasov suggests using moon rovers for the job, which are made to be light. One level of the roof has such dangerous levels of gamma radiation that it will even destroy a robot. As Pavel Gremov, a civilian liquidator draftee, arrives at the scene, he finds that other liquidators are already getting sick and are vomiting openly. He enters his tent in the barracks and is immediately offered vodka, but refuses to drink. He is greeted by Bacho, a Georgian soldier and Soviet-Afghan war veteran, who gives him an introduction to the place and takes Pavel under his wing, telling Yanek, the quartermaster, that nobody should mess with Pavel. Bacho tells him to cover his groin with lead to protect his lower half from radiation and offers to train him to hunt animals alongside Garo, an Armenian soldier. Ulana visits the Lomonosov Moscow University Library in order to research RBMK reactors. She prepares a list of documents that are listed under permission only and asks the librarian for permission to read them, citing herself as a member of the Soviet Central Committee. The librarian shows the list to her supervisor, who only allows her to see one document since the other documents are under redactions and secrecy by the Soviet state. Tarkhanov brings the moon rover to help Legasov and Boris clear the debris on the rooftop and tells them that the Central Committee has secured a German police robot to clear the dangerous level of the roof, dubbed Masha. Boris and Legasov smile and hug each other when the rover begins to clean the roof. Ulana goes to visit Dyatlov, finding that his condition has improved, but Dyatlov only tells her to leave. She asks for his help, but Dyatlov is dismissive. She then asks him to confirm if the reactor exploded after Akimov pressed the AZ-5 button, but Dyatlov says he doesn't know if the reactor exploded. She shows him the photograph of the exposed core. She then shows him a document she found in the State Archive written in 1976 about the operation of RBMK reactors under extreme conditions, but the names of the authors have been redacted and 2 pages removed. However, the state didn't redact the table of contents, which allowed her to deduce that the missing pages referred to a positive void coefficient, an AZ-5. When Dyatlov accuses her of trying to blame him, Ulana says she's not here to blame him, but to discover what happened with the reactor, and his confession can actually help Dyatlov avoid the death penalty. However, Dyatlov says her efforts do not determine the truth, but the state, and she will get the death penalty. Ulana angrily leaves. Pavel, Bacho, and Garo arrive for their hunt. When Bacho notices Pavel struggling with the rifle, he helps him reload. He then tells Pavel his 2 rules: not to point the gun at Bacho, and not to leave an animal to suffer, but to shoot it dead. They enter an abandoned neighborhood and Bacho starts whistling, alerting pet dogs who start running toward them. Once they do, however, Bacho and Garo start shooting, and Bacho sends Pavel door to door to shoot hiding pets. Pavel finds one dog sitting and tries to tell it to leave, but it doesn't. When the dog barks, Pavel shoots it, but it doesn't die. As it whimpers in pain, Pavel doesn't find the strength to shoot it, forcing Bacho to make the shot. He angrily reminds him again not to let them suffer. When they sit down for dinner, Pavel cannot find his appetite, and to calm his nerves, Bacho tells him to drink vodka. He tells Pavel that he's lucky that his first kill was a dog. For most soldiers, it's a human being. Bacho tells a story of himself from Afghanistan when he first killed a man and couldn't pick up his gun for the entire day. The following day, however, he recovered and resumed his work. The German robot arrives in September, named the Joker. The robot is dropped on the rooftop using a helicopter. However, it is fried instantly by the radiation. Boris realizes that the level of radiation was falsely reported by the Soviet Central Committee to the Germans in order to avoid humiliation. He calls the Kremlin in a state of fury, losing his bureaucratic tone for once, and tells them that they're all responsible, including Gorbachev. He breaks the phone in frustration. At night, Boris, Legasov, and Tarakanov contemplate how to remove the debris from Masha. Tarakanov says that the Central Committee has responded that there are no more robots available. Legasov says that their only option now is to use men. Meanwhile, Pavel, now an experienced hunter, continues his hunt with his crew. He enters an apartment complex for his door-to-door hunt, only to come across a whole family of dogs, including little puppies. Bacho tells him to go outside, taking the responsibility on himself to kill them. The dead animals are gathered in a truck, buried in a mass grave and covered with concrete. By October, Tarakanov is forced to enlist 3,828 liquidators in 90-second missions to clear the debris by hand. The liquidators are covered in protection and warned not to spend more than 90 seconds on the rooftop. The liquidators climb the stairs, wait at the opening of the roof to catch their breath, and rush to the rooftop to clear the debris while making sure not to look down into the core. As some pieces of graphite can weigh up to 50 kilograms, 2 men lift it together. One man's foot is caught under graphite, and he notices that the heat has instantly cut through it. Meanwhile, Lyudmila goes into labor. Ulana returns to Pripyat, where Boris and Legasov invite her to an abandoned building to speak privately to her. Legasov informs her that Dyatlov, Brukhanov, and Fomin will be put on trial and called to provide expert testimony. Before that, the Central Committee wants to send Legasov to the headquarters of the Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna to tell the world what happened at Chernobyl. To aid him, Ulana offers him a timeline she made of the events in the control room prior to the explosion. She believes that Dyatlov, Toptanov, and Akimov are guilty of gross incompetence, violation of safety regulations, and recklessness during their safety test. But the explosion is not their fault. She shows him an article saying that 2 pages have been removed, but Legasov has seen it before. He tells her to believe him that they didn't know that this could cause an explosion. He then tells them of a story from 1975 when a fuel channel ruptured in an RBMK reactor in Leningrad. Though the operators pressed the AZ-5, instead of the power going down immediately, it went up for a brief moment. A colleague of Legasov, Volkov, posed this question and wrote that article. But because that plant was functioning under normal circumstances, the control rods compensated for that. However, The staff stalled the reactor during the test at Chernobyl and pulled out all the control rods to bring the power back. Volkov had realized that when the control rods are re-entered into the core, the first thing that enters is not boron, but their graphite tips, which caused the reactivity to go up dramatically. But the Chernobyl staff didn't know about this because though Volkov warned the Kremlin 10 years ago, the Soviet state suppressed his research to remove doubts about the supremacy of the Soviet nuclear industry. Ulana urges Legasov to broadcast this design flaw to the International Atomic Energy Agency at the conference in Vienna, but Boris warns Legasov of the personal dangers of exposing state secrets. Ulana says there are 16 RBMK reactors in the Soviet Union, which need to be fixed before the events of Chernobyl are repeated. Boris proposes making a deal with the KGB to quietly fix the reactors, but Ulana calls him naive. To convince Boris, Ulana tells him that Lyudmila gave birth, but her baby died within 4 hours due to radiation exposure from Vasily, absorbing it in Lyudmila's stead. She tells them to no longer sacrifice their children for their own brief survival. The roof of Chernobyl is cleaned, and the flag of the Soviet Union is hoisted to congratulate the workers on their victory. Pavel hardens into a soldier. In the nursery, Lyudmila grieves the loss of her child, and the 4th episode ends. Episode 5. 12 hours before the explosion, Pripyat is a normally functioning city, quite like any other. Its streets are vibrant with families, and Lyudmila lives a normal life with Vasily. Dyatlov goes to work, unaware of what awaits him there. Fonin tells him that Bryukhanov might be promoted if the safety test is performed successfully. Naturally, Fonin will replace Bryukhanov, and he wants to pick Sitnikov to replace him. Dyatlov wants himself to be considered, but Fonin says he'll keep that in mind. However, when Bryukhanov enters the room, he tells them that they have to wait, as he's just received a call from the grid controller in Kiev, saying they cannot lower their power any further for another 10 hours because it's the end of the month, and they have to meet their productivity quotas. However, desperate for promotion, Fomin and Bryukhanov decide not to scrap it but simply delay it, as Fomin assures him that running at half power won't cause any stability issues. He asks Dyatlov to confirm it, and Dyatlov assures that it won't, and that he will personally supervise the test 10 hours later, with the hope that Fomin will now consider his name for the promotion. At present in Moscow, Legasov is approached by a KGB agent, who takes him to meet Charkov in a car. He lauds Legasov for omitting the AZ-5 design flaw from his testimony at the Vienna conference, which is attributed instead to the operator error. He offers him an award as the hero of the Soviet Union, their highest civilian honor, which even Charkov has never received. Furthermore, Legasov has been promoted to the position of director of the Kurchatov Institute. However, Charkov reminds him that these awards are not his until he gives the desired testimony at the trials of the Chernobyl staff. Legasov then asks about the requested changes to the reactors, which haven't been made in months. But Charkov insists that design reforms must wait until after the trial of Dyatlov, Fomin, and Bryukhanov, whom the Soviet state is hoping to blame for the disaster. When Legasov returns to his apartment, he notices his hair falling, the effects of radiation poisoning. A knock on his door surprises him. It's Ulana, who says that she does not trust the state to follow through. Legasov agrees with her. She tells him to tell the truth at the trial. Legasov says it's a show trial, as the jury has already been given the verdict, but Ulana informs him that the Central Committee has invited the members of the scientific community to observe the trials, including their colleagues from everywhere they've worked before. Once they've heard the truth, the scientists will force the state into making the changes. However, Legasov tells her that Volkov was removed from his position for simply stating the truth, and these scientists are handpicked by the state and will not be stirred to any action. But Ulana reminds him that Legasov's word has weight. Legasov says he will be shot, but Ulana reminds him that many thousands have died trying to contain the situation. The trial begins with Judge Milan Kadnikov presiding. Bryukhanov, Fomin, and Dyatlov are placed as villains. Boris begins his speech, and a model of the Chernobyl power plant is brought into the room. Boris begins by questioning the need for a safety test, as the power plant had been functioning for quite some time. He then shows the documentation signed by Bryukhanov and Fomin after the construction of the power plant, for which Bryukhanov, Fomin, and Dyatlov were given awards by the state. But the document was a lie. For the three to receive these awards, all safety tests of the plant had to have been successfully completed, but one remained. The last safety test was concerned with a situation where the power plant would not have any power, due to a variety of reasons. Though every power plant comes with 3 diesel fuel backup generators, Bryukhanov realized that the backup generators took approximately 1 minute to reach the speed required to power the pumps and prevent a meltdown, and by that time, it would be too late. The principle of the safety test was to check whether you could take the electricity that was generated by the turbine while it was about to stop due to no power and transfer that electricity to the water pumps to bridge the 60-second gap till the generators came up. They simulated blackout conditions to test this, but it failed the first, second, and third time they tried, and the fourth time came the disaster. Ulana is then brought to the stage and begins by mentioning how, prior to the safety test, Bryukhanov had received a call from grid officials in Kiev asking to scrap the safety test. A competent management, she argues, would have canceled the test because this delay in the safety test created 2 problems, scientific and human. Because there was a shift change, the night shift people had not been trained to perform the test and had to actually read the instructions before the test rather than do it from practice. When Dyatlov entered the office, he was very dismissive of any engineer who claimed that he was unaware of the procedure, and Akimov and Toptanov merely proceeded with it in order to not lose their jobs. Toptanov, who was responsible for controlling and stabilizing the reactor, was 25 years old and had 4 months of total experience. To elaborate on the scientific issue, Ulana gives the stage to Legasov. Legasov, clearly nervous, begins by illustrating how a nuclear reactor works. The main principle behind it is nuclear reactivity, which is controlled by the operators. Fission releases energy, which continues to increase until water and control rods bring it to manageable levels. Steam from the water increases the reactivity again, but it also produces a negative temperature coefficient, which means as nuclear fuel gets hotter, it becomes less reactive. As uranium splits apart, it breaks into a new element called xenon, which reduces reactivity. When the core is running at full power, it burns the xenon away before it can cause problems. But because of the delay, the reactor at Chernobyl held xenon for 10 hours. The core was poisoned, and its balance was lost. It is revealed that while Akimov and Toptanov were slowly reducing the power, Dyatlov bullied them into hurrying, and when Akimov practiced caution, Dyatlov, who was meant to supervise the test, left the room. The moment he left, however, power began to sporadically go down, and Akimov realized that the core was poisoned. Dyatlov, however, blamed Akimov and Toptanov for this. Akimov accepted the responsibility and decided to shut the reactor down for 24 hours, as the core could be a xenon pit by now. But Dyatlov wanted to finish the test that night and told them to raise the power again. Akimov and Dyatlov had broken into an argument about it, which ended when Dyatlov threatened to fire Akimov and ruin his career, should he not comply. Desperate, Akimov told Dyatlov to officially record his command, but Dyatlov refused to record it. Dyatlov denies being in the room and says that he was in the toilet. However, the prosecutor uses testimonies recorded by Ulana to prove that Dyatlov was in the room. Suddenly, Boris's cough grows worse, and the court enters a recess. Legasov finds Boris outside, who reveals that he has cancer and has maybe a year to live. He laments the fact that he will die as an inconsequential man, and it was Legasov who did all the work. However, Legasov replies by telling him that any scientist other than Legasov could have sufficed, but Boris did everything in his power to help Legasov, which any other bureaucrat wouldn't have. The court resumes and Legasov is brought to the stand again. He begins by arguing that the only safe way for the power plant was to raise the power slowly over the course of 24 hours, but Dyatlov wanted it down now. To please Dyatlov, Akimov and Toptanov had to pull out 205 control rods out of the total 211. Despite all this, they only managed to raise the power to 200 megawatts. At midnight, Toptanov was given a report from the reactor's computer system recommending a shutdown of the reactor. The report was shown to Dyatlov, who dismissed it. In less than a second, the balance shifted towards increased reactivity due to the absence of all control rods and water. The remaining xenon was burned away, and there was nothing left to stop the reactivity except the AZ5 button. When Legasov mentions the AZ5, Dyatlov throws a tantrum, accusing Legasov of lying. The court is about to be adjourned, but Legasov says he still has evidence to present. The prosecutor tells Legasov that his testimony is finished, but Boris stands up and tells the judge to allow Legasov to finish. Legasov mentions that Dyatlov had pushed the reactor to the brink of destruction due to his belief in the AZ5, but he didn't know about a fatal design flaw of the AZ5 emergency shutdown button, which is that when the control rods enter the core, their graphite tips enter first, which increase reactivity. When the judge questions why, Legasov explains that it's cheaper, which is also the cause of other design flaws in Soviet reactor. Once the lid of the core was blown away, oxygen rushed in, which combined with hydrogen and superheated graphite and caused an explosion. The judge mentions Legasov's testimony in Vienna, and Legasov admits that his Vienna testimony was a lie, and that Dyatlov, Akimov, and Toptanov rightly believed the button to be infallible because the Soviet state concealed the flaw. The RBMK reactor exploded only because of the state's lies. Once the trial is over, Legasov is immediately arrested by the KGB. After some time, Charkov appears, carrying a list of Legasov's activities from his youth. At the Kurchayov Institute, Legasov was the Communist Party's secretary and limited the promotion of Jewish scientists to curry favor from Kremlin officials. He mentions this to remind Legasov that he's one of the states that he's accusing right now. Because Legasov has appeared in Vienna, Charkov cannot have him shot. However, he tells Legasov that his efforts were useless, that his testimony will not be accepted by the state and will not be told to the press, as though it never happened. However, to punish him, the KGB will strip Legasov of his titles, awards, and social community and give credit for his work to other men. He asks if Boris or Ulana were also part of this conspiracy, but Legasov denies the allegations. Before leaving, Charkov forbids him from talking to Boris or Ulana and from mentioning Chernobyl ever again. He sees his friends one last time before being taken away by the KGB. Legasov's suicide, exactly 2 years after the explosion of Chernobyl, caused his memoirs to be widely circulated and forced the USSR to admit the truth and retrofit all nuclear reactors. This is where the show ends.